hope that more and more people actually consider the ocean to be more than important, like essential. I didn't grow up near the ocean. I grew up like in a city, Ghent. But apparently my family, my last name, Mijts, comes from a seafaring family. They were actually whalers, so like on the wrong side, but in those days they didn't know any better. So that was always part of like the family legacy. That's one part of ocean. The second thing is that in our Dutch family home, I grew up in Belgium, but it was a very Dutch family. We all had our own coffee spoon, and I had a boat, a ship, and it actually said het kofschip. And if you're familiar with the Dutch language, you know that these are actually the consonants that dictate a certain kind of ending for a verb. So it had like the ocean in it and language, and I'm a linguist with a passion for the ocean, so that fits. And the sea in itself was the North Sea. So that was really related to those days of going out to the sea because that is what people did, but it not being meaningful to me in those days. That only came later, especially when I started like getting a passion for maps.
Okay.
And I can bring that back to the age of 8, I think, that in my bedroom I had one of those old school maps, and I started imagining travels over land and travels over sea. And that's where the ocean became a place of imagination. The ocean as the place of imagination, of dreams. And more I was like building model ships and having those dreams about. The weird thing was like I wanted to be a veterinarian and I wanted to go to sea, and then at a certain moment I was thinking like maybe I can be a veterinarian at sea, which doesn't make too much sense. And then it became meaningful, especially while living here. I moved to Aruba in 1999, and I had been sailing in Europe, but here we really got our own ship, a very old boat from 1963, and started engaging with the ocean as part of it. First part of the surface, and then also diving. And for me that has been a transformative experience, because sailing and diving have taught me that about superficiality and depth, about the way in which you can engage with something like the ocean without giving meaning to it and only thinking about speed during sailing races or whatsoever. But you can also think about it as a huge living organism of which you are allowed to be part and that you have to respect. And I think over the years I've learned to respect the ocean in that way. A very meaningful moment was like sailing towards Puerto Rico and getting to know my first hurricane firsthand, and that was Hurricane Dennis, and sailing into it and realizing that whatever happened there was up to the way you related to your ship and the way the ship related to the ocean and to the circumstances, and getting into that storm and getting out of it have both been decisive for how I stand in life nowadays. Sailing in itself, diving in itself, swimming, I swim every week in the ocean. Understanding your relation with humans, the fragility of what we humans do on the surface of this planet, if you compare that to the fragility of what you do as a team on a sailboat, getting somewhere, trying to get somewhere. But also for me the whole concept of the enigma of arrival. I don't know whether you know that idea that the path is more meaningful than the destiny or than the destination in itself. So if you ask me about what are the big memories of sailing, it's not about arriving somewhere, but being on your way to somewhere, finding your way, navigating your own path. And that has led for me to deeper forms of understanding. And it has also taught me, one of the projects that I've been engaged in was at the Netherlands Institute of Advanced Studies in Amsterdam, where I was working with a team and where I was mainly focusing on what happens with us humans, that we can look at the surface, whether it's terrestrial or aquatic, but mainly the ocean, and not see through it. If you go to expositions about the ocean, you'll always see pictures of a ship on the water, of a wave and the reflecting surface, of a coastline, but never or hardly ever you look through the water and see what's beneath it. And that has helped me understand how superficial our reasoning often is, and how superficial our reasoning about sustainability, about engagement with the planet, about engagement with other than human presence is, because we only look at what we can see and we don't try to define what is behind that. And that has taught me a lot. I don't say that I know, I just learned to develop another form of curiosity, form of wanting to understand, and also realization that I can never understand. So both are simultaneously there. Yeah.
It's changed the way in which you approach questions, right?
It changed the way in which I approach questions, approach human development, the word development in itself, and also the relevance or irrelevance of our own actions. Yeah. For me, these work and life are very strongly intertwined, because I have the extreme luxury of doing a job that I really believe is meaningful and can be meaningful, a bit like you. So it becomes you. But of course, I also have that private life, and one of the things, like sailing has become my big hobby, my big thing. The sailing has become that a cornerstone of my own life, and since 2002 we've had our own boat, and milestones in life are measured in a way by the big expeditions that we do with a boat, whether it's participating in the regatta over here, or whether it's like last Sunday just going out on the water with a team and really enjoying that connectivity with the water, that direct connectivity. That's really great. Diving, of course, is a way in order to encounter the ocean yourself, and for the past years I've also worked on doing macro photography. One of the very simple reasons being my eyes are not that good anymore, so a macro camera will make me be able to see things that I normally cannot perceive. But also because I want to share beauty, but also distress underwater. And unfortunately, if you look well, you see a lot of stressors. And it's actually just like I talked about, a superficiality. We are very good at creating this kind of hypes about what we should see. Bioluminescence underwater all of a sudden is a big thing in Bonaire, for example, and it's just marketing. It has been there always. But now, because the corals are dying, you want to make people look at something else and have them get on the plane back and be excited about bioluminescence underwater. And now people are getting on the plane and they're talking about the ostracods, because you might have to see them. And if you haven't seen them, you haven't had your real time in Bonaire. So there's also that imagination that takes over there. So that's the diving part, and diving photography, and now being part of the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. We also engage with students to help them do monitoring for coral restoration, biodiversity monitoring. And that makes me happy, that not what we see, but the reality of it, that we can make those students also look underwater and in that way engage in a different way, because we don't do a good job there as an island community, relating to that water that we have. What else do? We have the project ongoing with Violeta Lopez Marquez on the genetic connectivity of the coral reefs between Bonaire, Curaçao and Aruba, which is a very interesting research project in which we map genetic diversity and also genetic resilience. Where are the resources, where are the sinks, where are the source populations, where are the sink populations, and how can you develop from there an understanding of the health of the ecosystem as a whole. It's not research that makes you happy. but it's research that makes you help understand. And people often think that I'm a very negative person because I talk about quite depressing things a lot, but it's because it is quite depressing, a lot of it. So that's something that we engage in, and then related to that, I also try to understand, together with a group of people, including Maarten Eppinga from the Earth System Science Group in Zurich, and Anouk Mertens from the KU Leuven, who now also works with me, and Tobia de Chicholo, how you can engage young people in island communities with basic means for education for sustainable development. And it also gets into it education about mangroves, education about seagrass beds, education about fish populations, etc. So we try as best as we can to also do that. A last thing there is that I spent half a year at NIAS then for that study on understanding our awareness, our perception of the ocean. And from that come all kinds of new projects, actually, new connections where people really want to understand what we are doing here, what we're experiencing here. 2 weeks from now we'll have Turning the Tide, the conference on climate change, social change and islandness. Because if you look at an island, I mean, an island territory is small. An island's ocean is huge. Our ocean has more volume than the Dutch North Sea. We may not have as much shoreline, but we have much more water and water ecosystem. And we fail to understand it. And we need to do so much more in order to understand who we can be with that ocean and how we can take care of it, rather than just using it as a sewage dump, as we do now. Like, the whole concept of water is quite unique the way it occurs on Earth. We have water that is not frozen and is not vapor, but that is like forming a very thin layer on the crust of our globe. And it's not that much. It looks like a lot, but if you would compress it into a ball and put it next to the globe, it's a very small volume of water in comparison to the volume of Earth. That actually is divided over the Earth's surface in potable water, drinkable water. I always forget the name in English. Non-salty water and salt water, and that has a species divide to it, and it has a ecosystem divide to it, and that's wild. That's something to start with, and then understanding how that biodiversity has come to be. So how that has developed, and how we have an enormous biodiversity that has built up on that solution that we call the ocean, where water is the driving force, is the life force, and the dissolved oxygen is the way in which that water keeps life ongoing. But also that you have species that live without oxygen, because you have the dissolved oxygen, but you also have species that live off other substances, and also that is extremely representative of how unique life in itself is, how diverse life in itself is, how that can come to be in anaerobic there you go, anaerobic, yes, circumstances. It's also the big CO2 sequestration mass. If you consider how all the sediment that you see in the sediment layers that you see in rock formations, how that is actually all skeletons of microorganisms that have sedimentated over the ages, and how millions of years of development can be seen there, that you can look back in time. And we use it as building blocks for cathedrals, and then we tell each other that those cathedrals are so old, while not realizing that it's actually the stones that are such a unique feature of our world. and are millions of years old. That is something that fascinates me too at the ocean. And then, yeah, the fish abundance, corals, nematodes, mollusks, anything that you see there. If you only look at an octopus and spend time watching how it chases, how it lives, how it creates a nest, how it interacts with its environment, that's so cool. It's so beautiful. In an interview lately, I told about being given a cowrie shell by an octopus, because it was actually something that you don't take it out of the ocean. You don't want that. I only take stuff that washes up on shore. But this time I knew there was an octopus there because there were 7 cowrie shells at one place. And I was looking at it and I was tempted to take one. And then the octopus put out an arm with number 8. And I took that one because it felt to me, and this is our storytelling about the ocean, of course, that the octopus gave it. We're allowed to tell stories because that's the only power that we have as humans when it comes to that. And then when you bring in humans in the equation, of course, a lot of people see it as a surface that is used for transportation, a surface that is used to cover up what we don't want to see, which is waste, which is disruption. If you read the unnatural history of the sea, your eyes are opened to the way in which we have kind of terraformed the ocean, turned it into some kind of farmland out of which we wanted to extract resource, fish meat. So there's all these aspects to it for me. And for Aruba then it's also drinking water. If you look at the way we live on our island, the realization that we have about 120,000 plus non-documented, plus the tourists, all drinking water, and we don't have fresh water, that's the term, we don't have fresh water for all those people, but we just like extract water from seawater to turn it into potable water, and we use it to clean our cars and to flush our toilets and to drink it. But that's also a big thing for me, that realization that ocean is giving that to us. While asking nothing in return, but that is the nature of ecosystems. It doesn't ask, it gives. The human mistake there is that you can, if something gives, you can take without paying a price. And that's what you're seeing right now. Unlimited extraction leads to total ecosystem degradation. And I think that is what we're seeing right now in Aruba. A lot of people are look, and I'm also studying on that because it's one of the things that I can do with social ecological systems. What do we do? How do we do that? But it often leads to how can these be put on top somewhere and then use resources. And we have a tendency of nowadays also expressing the value of nature in US dollars. Now for me that's a very schizophrenic thing to do. There is really like a tension there for me where monetizing value of something of such immeasurable worth degrades it to only that monetary value. And everybody who says like I've got no relation to the ocean simply has not looked long enough at the basis of life, because the ocean is where we come from, the ocean is where we go to, which is the circle of life simply. It is the resource of life forms, but it's also the resource of oxygen, support. People talk a lot about trees, and trees are very important for biodiversity and for carbon sequestration, but the ocean is even bigger when it comes to that, because the whole cycle of Sahara dust and the diatoms that form and then become the part of the start of the food cycle in the ocean, and hence forming oxygen and capturing carbon, that is so fundamental to our being, that understanding the impact that we have on that ocean should be part of what kids learn in school. If you let me dictate what kids have to learn in school, it would be a completely different curriculum, and there would be very little economy and a lot of ecosystems thinking in there. So the Sahara dust could actually be part of sediment and land.
Yeah, I was thinking, now we connected them.
Yeah, we're getting closer there. Yes. So humans are part of that system, and that whole humanistic, like after the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages humans were still, like also in literature and in descriptions, humans and animals and nature were still kind of on a par. There was some kind of mythology about a lot of stuff because we didn't know, but human superiority wasn't proclaimed. Actually, more like if you look at pre-Renaissance writers and painters, actually the human in quite a miserable state within that nature, and nature was the strength and humans were vulnerable. And then you go to that Enlightenment thinking, and however much reason is in there, and however much we've been taught in schools that reason is the essence of our being, we've learned to disconnect ourselves from nature in doing so. And I think that's a big mistake. Reason comes in very handy, and I like to speak with reasonable people and people that can think critically. But if you think critically, you also have to realize that there is no such thing as a top and a end position. There's only cycles of being, cycles of engagement, cycles of relation. Being here now doesn't leave me here but takes me somewhere else again. So all these aspects have been kind of tossed out of the window, and I think that now in the 21st century we're coming to realize that, at least bigger and bigger groups of people. And then social ecological systems are not only about the value of nature anymore as feeding and providing economic opportunity, but really as humans as part of that life system. And yeah, I don't know what that means for the future, but at least it helps humanity engage in a different way, and maybe lose kind of that hubris, of that arrogance of being. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that also goes a long way into answering the next part of the question, because most people do this and then they don't mention the humans because they don't think of humans as part of the ocean system. Yeah. And so we have the next question is like to add humans. But you've already done it. So.
Yeah, but maybe I do want to say something about it, because that is part of that human nature of being very terrestrially oriented. Also when it comes to nature conservation in the ocean and management of that and all those things, it's all land-based. Obviously we don't have gills, we're poor swimmers if you compare ourselves to a fish. I sometimes think when I'm swimming in the ocean that a fish must be laughing because we're plodding along in the water, we're hitting the surface, and they're really like, my God, what are they doing? But we fail to see beyond our own physical boundaries, and so that is about that surface, but it's also about time. So where do we position, place and time, where do we position ourselves? That's one. But second, of course, also like understanding what was 50 years ago. I was 2 years old, 50 years ago. When I read the descriptions of the state of coral reefs in 1970, 1971, I read about a completely different world. And when I talk about this with a lot of people in Aruba, they just tell me that I'm making this up. because they have learned to see Aruba as it is now. And for example, seeing coral can be like seeing a little piece of coral, and if you point at it and you say, this is special, this is coral, people will say, wow, I've seen coral, I'll bring all my friends and we all go and see that one piece of coral. And then one of them takes it away, of course, because it's such a magnificent thing. And I do my presentations nowadays starting with coral skeletons and making people appreciate those skeletons before telling them this is that. Because we can engage in all kinds of different ways and forget and ignore what actually was. And that is also our capacity when we leave the humans out of the ocean. We're apparently good at saying we have no responsibility there. Our responsibility is here on land. And we'll go like put our feet in the water, but then we run back out when we feel something slimy. Because the number of yelling tourists is quite big, especially in places where you have a lot of seagrass. And then the first activity that comes to people's mind is removing the seagrass, rather than the human saying, maybe I shouldn't be going there. Maybe I should just respect that. So humans like to kind of shape it towards themselves and draw that line where they feel comfortable. The ocean is not a comfort zone.
I like that. The ocean is not a comfort zone.
Yeah. That's one of the things I learned in that hurricane. It's not a comfort zone.
Yeah, so the questions we had here was like, would you divide this up into specific groups of humans? Like you did a little bit with, so right now these are like general things that humans do, but would you have like, and specifically thinking for Aruba, like are there organizations or like just sections of society that interact in different ways? Or?
I'd love to do that. I don't see that as a homogeneous group. I'm going to make a couple of divides there. I normally don't like that, but there are divides. And one of them is that when talking about the ocean, we talk about ocean conservation also, the 30 by 30 agenda and things like that. And for me, that 30 by 30 agenda also has a cynical side to it, because it's the global north, global northern organizations celebrating the protection of nature towards 2030, while failing to have done that in their own pasts. Because if you look at the North Sea, for example, it's a dead zone. It's completely flattened. Everything that was there, if you read like 15th century and 13th century documentation, that is not there anymore. Part of the seafaring Dutch nation has come about by them going further and further to find fish. And now those nations are imposing nature conservation zones in the global south in order to come to that 30% norm, while not giving the means, while not providing the means. And the locations that are identified are very problematic to me, because the locations that are identified as conservation zones are the locations where people, if people were present, have been living in harmony with nature to such an extent that the biodiversity in these areas has been conserved. And then the West comes and imposes the IUCN conservation norms. And the first thing that is done in the new marine park in Curaçao is make moorings for boats in order for tourists to be able to enter the leftover pristine nature. And that for me is problematic, because the community there has been living in balance with that nature, and that works out, and then it has to be managed. And if you look at the IUCN norms, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, they have 6 different categories of nature conservation, and they all don't talk about what you want to keep, but they talk about what actions humans can do in these areas. So it's not focused on nature, but it's focused on humans. And so for me there's a big distinction between those communities that lived in harmony with nature, those that come from abroad and use nature conservation and nature images as part of the propaganda of what they're selling. And if you look at Aruba, there's a big thing there, because tourism, of course, uses nature. The pictures of the trees where we're sitting right now are used in the propaganda of what a beautiful Caribbean island looks like. But at the same time, it's a money-making industry, so any form of conservation of nature is only done to the extent that it is enforced and is seen as a marketing tool, rather than an inherent value that should be at the basis of that tourism. So there is a big divide for me there. And I'm not blaming anybody who works in the tourism industry when I say this, but it's just a mechanism, it's just a system of shareholder value, pushing boundaries, pushing limits, and not taking nature's value into account when driving entrepreneurship in that area. And there's a couple of people at this moment on the island working very well also from that perspective, from nature inclusive thinking. But it's a long way to go. It's a very long way to go. So those are groups that I can identify. International organizations imposing conservation thinking in combination with community that had a balance with nature, tourism industry, and this applies to Aruba, this applies to Jamaica, this applies to the Netherlands, this applies to Canada. Everywhere where there's economic development, and that word development is very weird for me, you have that whole plantation structure where the well-being of those that were is not the basis, and that's human and other than human, but the profit is taken as the basis. And so that's something that you really can see there. Other groups, of course, the tourists themselves. But you know the story about the Homo touristicus. From the moment they get on a plane, their sense of ownership and responsibility changes, because you have no ownership of this location. It also means for a lot of people it takes multiple years of engaging with Aruba, for example, as a tourism destination before people can start engaging with its nature, etc. And sometimes you get some kind of tourism activism from that. People taking part in beach cleanups, taking part in the support of stray dog projects. That's the kind of thing that tourists can recognize, of course. It's completely different from long-term engagement of people like you, of Metabolic Foundation, of organizations like the Caribbean Lionfish Association, or Balanta y Planta, or other organizations that really do something for the long run, for the island, and foster ownership and empowerment for the people themselves. Because that's the last group for me, and that is the population of the island in general, where you want to look at how much opportunity do people have to really engage with their own lived and living environment. And how much time do you have, how much information do you get? Do you get nature documentaries? Do you get exposure to nature in classrooms? Do you get to understand what something like the landfill is doing to our waters and to our national health? National health including, again, the non-humans. And I see enormous potential for development there. I'm trying to put this in a positive way. When it comes to school curricula, when it comes to research, when it comes to nature programs, and not only doing it as a fun thing for a week for a kid, but making it a lifelong citizen-making objective, that you care for nature. Because if we don't care, nobody else will do it. And we're a former colony, and in plantation economies that we are derived from, Aruba was not a plantation economy, but we are derived from the concept of a plantation economy. Ownership of the own land is taken away from the populations, everybody is displaced, and in that displacement it's extremely difficult to take responsibility for your own new surroundings. So that's a number of groups that I could identify.
So now we have like our initial understanding of, like the basic of the ocean, and then our human interaction with it. Now we want to hop in a spaceship and go to 2100.
It's a time ship.
Yeah, time traveling spaceship.
Yeah. Okay.
Time-space continuum.
Yes.
And then ask you, we can forget about, well, we'll keep this here as inspiration, but what do you think the ocean looks like around Aruba? Like, we'll focus from here and then we can move out, but let's start in Aruba.
Keeping me rooted in one spot, that's a challenging thing. I think what we're going to see is a rapid succession of. So first, I'm getting there. I'm not yet in 2100, but before we are there, we're seeing a lot of stresses. We're seeing a lot of disruptions, and what comes with that is that species that have not had space, room for development, that were like confined to a small niche, sometimes blossom very quickly. Blooms of whatever, can be bacteria, can be nematodes, can be small fish species, all kinds of accidental, like we had with the sharp-nosed pufferfish recently, where all of a sudden they're so abundant, but they're also all sick because they didn't have nurture, food, and they immediately got like an infection. So there was a combination of all kinds of factors. But this kind of blooms, I think we can expect that to happen a lot. Sudden eruptions of one species or one subspecies that all of a sudden finds a platform, a hold of what happens. Could be seagrass, could be mollusks, could be frogfish, could be bird species, seabirds. I don't know. I mean, but we're going to see that. And we humans have a tendency of calling that pests, because pests, they take away opportunity from us for harvesting. But at the end of the day, it's just like humans. We take up a niche wherever we can, and those species are going to do the same because of those disruptions that create more opportunities. And I think we should be happy if that's happening, because that would also mean that the oxygen balance and the acidity balance of the ocean also remain stable. You are aware of the hypoxic zones in the Pacific. The first hypoxia event has taken place near the San Blas Islands and Islas del Toro in Panama a couple of years ago. So that's been described that the same happened there. There's where no life forms remain. So I'm really giving the positive story here. So that's going to happen. If that happens, and there you have a lot of activity in the water, by the way.
Yeah.
You see, the water is alive, so it's not a pest. It's a growth of nature.
Birds are happy.
The birds are happy, and maybe some larger fish under the water are also happy, but the small ones are not too happy. What will happen? Everybody is talking about the Great Reset and upcoming disaster and things like that. We humans have always lived in disaster circumstances. If you look at history, there's been like a succession of stresses for humanity. It's not as if we've lived in paradise for 2,000 years or for 70,000 years. It's never been paradise. We've never been better off than now. While at the same time saying that, you also realize that a lot of people are very poorly off. People living in West Africa, people living in the Middle East, Afghanistan, without access to sufficient food and water, without any kind of security about tomorrow. And that turns us all into, well, almost whiners who are like, oh my God, it's so scary. We're talking about 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And it's not going to be a disruption in such a way that there will be no humanity anymore, but there will be new balances. So that ocean in 2100, 77 years from now, I'll never see it, unless you figure out a time ship. It will be a new balance. And Earth, life, has it in itself to start developing new life forms, But we don't have to be impatient. We are single-handedly responsible for the largest extinction event, the fastest extinction event ever. I mean, we could never imagine it as humans that we could be worse than a meteor, but we are. And we have to realize, for example, I had a visit from those people that are work on the geological history of coral reefs, and we were discussing how long does it take for a reef like Harbor Reef in Aruba to build up to the state that it is in now, and we couldn't get below 700 years, but most probably 2,000 up to 3,000 years in order for that to become a stable ecosystem as we knew it 20 years ago. And that is totally gone now. So we will need time, the ocean will need time. It's up to humans to maintain their own livability. I mean, if you put me in the desert right now, I will live for half a day maybe. I've been there, it's quite rough. If I go in there with all supplies, etc., I can survive, but not for a long term. Our fellow humans, the Tuareg, they go into the desert and they'll find their solutions there. For me, that metaphor is actually also one for humans. We have to find ways to deal with what we created ourselves and to live with that. It's humanity that causes it, not the individual, but it's humanity that will have to find ways to find a balance, and the ocean will deal with itself. I mean, the effect of humanity on the ocean is not too positive. So that's one thing. There's another thing that's kind of that I'm confused about at this moment. There's the Noah's Ark project on safeguarding coral reefs from global warming. I'm okay with people doing that. I mean, the Noah's Ark project is just safeguarding genetic material, just like a seed bank. Makes sense, is okay. But I think that really kind of looks at the world as in it has to be maintained as it is. And the whole idea of nature restoration to what it used to be. But the world has changed. And as long as we don't change our behavior and invest money in genetic harvesting of coral reefs and not in limiting our polluting actions, then we're not there yet. So for me that is a little bit of a cynical approach when you're talking about the Noah's Ark, because it's as if there's going to be like that great flood that's going to wash everything away, and then it has to be replanted. And it really kind of is telling for me as that humans want to be in the driver's seat of, look at me, I'm a savior of biodiversity here. I don't know. That's a very weird kind of heroism, which taps into certain forms of nature conservation that are not helpful for nature, but are primarily geared towards, yet again, the humans.
Yeah.
So it's human exceptionalism.
Just some big aquariums.
Yeah. The zoo as the keeper of wildlife in Africa, but you have to have it in Antwerp and in Amsterdam and in London, etc., in order to showcase, and then you have all those breeding programs. But more money is put into that than into the conservation of habitats where these animals used to live. That kind of weird conservation.
Just because we're an island community.
Yeah.
So how do you see the humans, and then again thinking of Aruba in 2100, like what are we doing?
Oh my God.
And in relationship to the ocean, but like kind of in that intersection between, like we are here, between land and water.
Yeah, there's a myriad of scenarios there, of course.
Just your general, like your best guess, your most honest estimate.
My most honest estimate would of course be I don't know, but if you let me dream, you could see, for example, a community that has redeveloped a balance with nature and has learned to understand the extreme value of that ocean, and also the nutrient value of that ocean, which means kelp forests or all kinds of vegetation that you can develop in combination with that incredible resource that we have. That would be great. It can also, of course, be completely destructive if you look at it from the current perspective. In Madeira, I saw the fish farms this summer, where, well, that are people immediately call them ugly, but that's because people are not used to looking at it. I mean, all kinds of human structures. There's a wall here.
That's
We don't call it
definitely
ugly. There are boats here. There's pillars in the water. There's a pier. There's all
that
kinds
thing
of
in
stuff.
the back, yeah.
Yeah, platform. But I don't believe that should be the point. The point is really about is that a basis for livelihood, and can that basis for livelihood be done in balance with nature? And if we're good, and if we do invest in localized and contextualized solutions, which also includes research and development of new strategies by young generations, so not by me, but by the people that come after me and by people like you, then I really believe in the potential of Aruba engaging in a completely different way with its own context, and the island being prosperous 70 years from now, 80 years from now. And prosperous not as in economically dollar-wise prosperous, but as in a community that can fend for itself, rather than the economy that we now have, where we are totally dependent on imported oil to make our water, and our water as such is also oil, 2 liters for a cubic meter, 2 liters of HFO for a cubic meter of water. So the food that we produce is derived from that water that is derived from the oil, and everything else is imported. And that can never, everybody who talks about when will we get to the threshold of sustainability forgets that you're looking at a threshold in the rearview mirror, because we've long passed the threshold as an island community. But we can build back towards it and find solutions there. I don't think that growth of the number of hotel rooms is the key. That's not something that I think is a long-term or sustainable strategy. But of course it's a short-term dollar-making strategy, and I fully understand it from that economics perspective, but it's in no ways a long-term environmental and sociological strategy.
What is your best case scenario for
my best
Aruba
case scenario?
And the ocean? Like, yeah, for our ocean in 2100. Like, if you really just like your dream scenario, you're already leading in the positive side, but
I think this was like with the humans in it. Now I'm going to say something dramatic here. The best scenario for the ocean is an ocean with less humans in between the ocean, less on islands and on land, less overuse of resources. If you look at the history of fisheries, you'll see that it started, that whole fisheries story, you had small groups of population, like I think the estimates now are that humans came to the Americas 20,000 years ago, but that's all like very basic day-to-day fishing. And the whole development of industrial fishing that happened in Western Europe and in China, that shows how every time resources became depleted, so you had to start building bigger ships, so you had to start going further, so you had to abstract larger quantities from resources far away from home, etc. And that then led to the survivability of the communities in Europe. Actually, overpopulation, it goes hand in hand with the availability of basic food. In order for the ecosystems to restore, that extraction is one thing that needs to be addressed. Alternative food sources are possible. That's the fun thing about the 21st century. But it also means we will have less grouper on the table. We will have less snapper on the table. We will have less salmon. Catch of the day, salmon, yay, in Aruba. These processes, if you look at them in a critical way, It's either take the humans out of the equation, and it means alternative eating habits for humans. And if there's no alternative eating habits, then it's a much more cynical approach. But the best scenario, you ask me, for the ocean would be take the humans out. Because then the balance can restore, which is not the best scenario that I see for the future in general. But if I would be the ocean, I would kind of wish for that.
All right.
But that's giving personality and agency to the ocean.
Now, I guess, looking at that question, the best scenario for Aruba?
Huh. For Aruba?
And Aruba, remember, Aruba is like 15 times more ocean than it is land. So the ocean is part of us, but...
It's in surface, right?
Yeah.
Is it? I think if you look at the economic zone, it's even more.
I thought it was based
Yeah, could be. Could be. That's 200 kilometers. It's quite a lot, that's for sure. Well, I think the scenario that I first described, where the community has learned to live in balance with that ocean and land, of course, that is a best scenario if you ask me.
All right.
The balancing act.
What makes it difficult?
To be like that?
To get there, yeah. Like, what are some bottlenecks? Why are we not heading in that direction necessarily?
No, I wouldn't say that we're not heading there. One of the things that you really see is the lack of acuteness of crisis. Business as usual is the easiest model to follow. Taking any other form of decision is a political and economic risk, and that is that whole concept of path dependency that you get when you look at politicology and economic studies and sociology. What happens with a community is you've started on a certain path, and from that pathway you derive identity, and from that identity you derive a business as usual model. Now, Aruba is an interesting example there, because we've had successive different economies. We've had gold as a driver for economic development. We've had guano as a driver for economic development. We've had aloe plantations as a driver for economic development, oil refining, and then tourism. So Aruba has demonstrated in the past to be able to reinvent itself. But now, the big question is, every time we changed from one industry to another, it was because the industry itself came to an end, because we had overused the resource. Also the oil industry, I mean, that's not the Aruban fault, but it's humanity's action. But also when you look at the guano, it wasn't interesting anymore because of dwindling prices. Gold was too expensive to get it out of the ground. Aloe got competition, but we still have active industry there, of course. But if we learn from those lessons about how our economy can come to a standstill, and we have been inventive and initiative rich, so that every time we were able to overcome that challenge of that standstill, then maybe we can also come to an understanding that the long-term resilience of Aruba is not in further overdeveloping tourism. For me, it feels like an overheated industry of more, and more senseless, more meaningless, to more diverse, meaningful ownership, localized people's ownership. And it comes to food, that comes to nature, that comes to culture, that comes to being happy with less, being totally okay with not wanting to be rich in dollars, but rich in livability and in livelihood. And I think that is a steep learning process for our community, but I think it's an important one. And then you can come to a balance, and that is my ideal perspective. That is where the ideal picture of Aruba is with humans. When I got here, I was emotional, as I told you, because I just heard from a friend of mine, Michael Teja, who's quite a well-known artist in the Netherlands, and now also is like being seen as one of the bigger artists in Europe. And he just submitted a project for the Prix de Rome, which is a poem that he wrote for a seminar that 2 colleagues and me were giving at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies. And I have the first version of the poem, and then the one that he turned into what he calls the real poem, and now he turned it into a huge artwork. Art is one way of shaking up the world, of creating purpose. What we can do is being as loud as possible without standing on people's toes, being out there with creativity, with messages, also messages of hope. Only giving warnings and making people afraid will never help, because human nature walks away from confrontation. Human nature walks away from seeing through that surface and taking responsibility. There's only a smaller group of individuals that do that, and that they are considered to be depressing, etc. I know that because people often tell me so. And this is not saying that that is the perfect way of being, because it's not nice. But finding ways to, in a creative way, engage with those conversations about how value can be so different, how self-respect and respect for your environment and for the community, and it goes hand in hand, environment and community, how that can create a new ideology, an ideology that really is inclusive of everything rather than only human short-term capital development. I think that is something that we really can contribute to. But it's a message for teachers, that's a message for parents, that's a message for the government, that's a message for everybody who is in whatever way engaged with humans. So it's all of us.
What is your worst case scenario?
It's as good as my best case scenario.
No more people?
Yeah. Look, if we're not creative and if we don't find ways to find a balance, it's not going to be no more people, but it's being a completely different world for everything to live in, including humans. There are major natural disruptions coming up. Aruba is not in the safe zone. The safe zones are higher up in the mountains and are higher up north and higher down south, which by the way is a directional absurdity, down south and up north, but that's because of the Europeans starting that language. A lot of disruption and a lot of unhappiness, yes. That's being honest. That's the worst case scenario.
And I guess if we're not gonna make it to the best case scenario, but we're gonna avoid the worst case scenario, what are some things that you think that we should start doing? What's that middle ground where you're like...
Yeah. It's interesting to see how many people answer this question from a perspective of maintaining the same standards of living while changing the way it is supplied. That's a mindset thing. That's a mindset thing that really is not really helpful in diminishing the footprint that we have. Hans Rosling made this, the late Hans Rosling made this. It was a very inspiring presentation about how the whole world could live with a certain standard of living without compromise and could be in balance. He used boxes to demonstrate that, and it's a very inspiring thing, and it actually,
right? How we can support 10 billion people on Earth.
10 billion people, but then it should also be enough. That was also his message. And I think we really have to look into the mirror and ask ourselves whether that is feasible if you look at the enormous footprint of the global northern citizen, and And if you extrapolate that to the whole of the globe, with the technologies that we have right now, it's impossible. The disruptions of climate are of such a nature, only based on 150 years of human activity with fossil fuels and coal. And don't forget disruption of the ocean, because the ocean is the biggest CO2 sequestrator, not the air. And if we disturb sediment, we actually release CO2 at an enormous pace. So if we keep on doing that in that way, we will not strike that balance. So that scenario where the middle ground scenario involves less consumption, reducing what we throw away, reducing what we discard, but also reducing what we start off to begin with. Our island is a great metaphor for that, or just an example. Everything that comes on our island through the harbor and the airport used to end up at Parquitebos, at the landfill. There was a very short cycle for a lot of products, and a lot of resources ended up over there. But that linearity really has to be turned around. But before we get to that linearity, we should simply ask ourselves, do we need this? Do we need to have things for ourselves? Do we need to have our own cars? Do we need to have large pieces of land? Do we need to have all those commodities that we have? And then you start to realize that maybe the path forward is not only creating technological advancement and alternatives to maintain standard of living, but actually maintaining standard of living without the extreme value that we attach to material stuff. And then we could come to a middle ground, definitely. It's never about the individual, it's about the fabric of society. What are the cultural norms and the economic standards that we use in order to describe who is allowed to get something and who not? Who can, what is produced? There's all kinds of ways to curb that, but we don't, because we've chosen a state form that actually facilitates maximization of exploitation. We used to do that by colonization as humanity, and that only served a very small group of people while neglecting the needs of humans and non-humans across the globe. And when that whole system was abandoned over the middle of the previous century, that role was taken over by private entrepreneurship. So rather than having state-funded military colonization and exploitation of resources, you had all the state companies in Great Britain and in Spain and in France and in Germany and in the Netherlands. It turned into private enterprise, defended by a legal apparatus that actually puts the interests of those companies above the interests of individual human beings, and ignoring totally the needs of communities that are not within the countries that are affected primarily by that economic activities. So for me, yeah, there was no inventor, it's just something that we as humanity developed. There's no blaming in this one. But everything, of course, also has to do with the norms and values of the time that you live in, and your scope of knowledge. And my mother, had she still lived, would be very happy to know that I'm doing economically well, because that was her main concern. That boy is never going to do well because he doesn't care for money. There was a concern for her. There was a fault in my being, and that's fascinating, right? Because that's. Of course, we, in hindsight, could have developed as humanity in a different way, in more balance, etc., etc., etc. But then we would never have been here having this conversation, and I would never have wanted to miss that. So I'm grateful for the development that has been, while realizing it's us all together. My big thing would be keep on looking below the surface.
One image that you think you would want to send to the future?
I would make it an overlay image of Harbor Reef. It took 3,000 years to build this. It took us a couple of decades to kill it.
That's a powerful one.
That's one that I could imagine. Yeah. I just want to make one point here, something that I recently saw, and I'm not sure where it was. I think it was in Madeira, but it could as well have been in the south of France, where in order to raise awareness on the consequences of our actions for the ocean, they had painted waves around sewer griddles, so where water gets into the sewer, and made a connection to the ocean by writing on that, I am the ocean, I will take what you put in here, be mindful of me. And it was such a strong image to me, because it combines art and creativity, but also puts the ocean on land. And I think as an ocean state, as a large ocean state, we have too little ocean on land. And then I'm not talking about taking stuff out of the ocean and putting it in aquaria and then replenishing that every day. But we have too little access to it. And there are multiple ways to do it. I really love the statue of the Driekeel. Why it had to be gold, I don't know. But putting it there is the leatherback turtle is so fundamental to the natural richness that we have. But yet again, it's a tourism landmark and not a community landmark. And I really want to find ways in order to get that ocean into the way we paint houses in public institutions, the artifacts that we put there, the statues that we put there, etc. That we keep the ocean and not the man-made tourism image of a pristine sand and a cleaned up ocean, because that's the picture that I always use, that I show people, like, this is something where everything you see of land and water is not nature, it's man-made. It's our manicuring the landscape to turn it into that perfect image. That's not it. The real image is the trees on the beach, and is the grass on the beach, and is us between that nature, not us taken out of nature in some kind of a picture. So bringing that into our public buildings, bringing that into the airport as a message for everybody who arrives in Aruba, bringing that into the government buildings. We call it a kokolishi, but nobody actually relates that kokolishi back to that ocean, but only to a plate with food. And it really should be, this is the ocean that envelopes us and cares for us.
If you think tourism in 2100, what is it doing to our ocean? What does it look like?
I don't.
Again, from an Aruba.
God, totally lost. Maybe tourism in 2100 is very organized, very restricted, and very exclusive from nature, and therefore nature inclusive, because it will simply keep a distance, like, from the natural areas in which it can engage.
Okay. And now, science and technology in 2100.
Oh.
Okay. How is Aruba
in Aruba?
engaging? Yeah.
In Aruba? Oh, I really see for me that there's already great collaboration between Metabolic Foundation and the University of Aruba, so that's just going to further explode. I really do hope that science and technology is going to be further integrated back into the curricula in primary and secondary schools, because keeping it out of there also keeps the Aruban student out of the university and high school opportunities that should actually be open to everybody, because we need it, and we need that fundamental knowledge. And then I also think that science and technology by then will have played a very important role in the emancipation of small island states as fundamental communities at the front line of climate change, at the front lines of biodiversity laws, at the front lines of social change, and therefore islandness will be a fundamental part of understanding science and technology for the 22nd century. Yeah.
So, climate change.
Yeah.
Same question.
Oof. A front line. Definitely. Maya Motley and what's his name, Stephen Kofi of Fiji, who was standing with his feet in the water addressing COP26. Climate change is highly going to affect what islands look like for the 21st century and beyond.
Economics. How is economics? What does it look like in 2100 for Aruba and the ocean?
Maybe finally economists and economics will be hierarchically put under environment and society rather than above it, and that would be a great position if you ask me. Yeah.
Policy.
Sorry? Policy. Oh. Research-based policy that is based on understanding checks and balances, trade-offs and synergies. I think synergy is a very important word here. It's going to be more and more important in order to get there. But it goes hand in hand. If you don't have a community that steps up and that asks for changes in policy and will ask for economic prosperity expressed in dollars, you will not get the policy that you need. So those things go hand in hand. Every 4 years we elect new politicians and they go define the policies that the departments in Aruba develop. And one way, maybe we need to also evaluate how our political system is constructed. It's not, I don't say get rid of democracy, but make sure that democracy has checks and balances that are needed to not only work in the interest of long-term placidity, acceptance of it's the way it is, we can't change a thing, into a community and politics that is development oriented, but development as in human capacity development. Yeah.
Great. Food.
Food?
You already mentioned a little bit about this. How do we think about food with Aruba and the ocean in 2100?
It could be a very strong synergy there. We need it, because if we can depend on, human inventivity always comes in times of need. If we need to find alternative ways to feed ourselves without exploiting short-term the resources we have, then we will need to find new ways, long-term, sustainable ways to develop food resources with the ocean. Yeah.
Biodiversity? You also mentioned some ideas about that earlier.
Yes, well, it's a disaster. That's why I can't immediately say something, because it really touches me. Biodiversity disaster will go on for the next decades. At the same time, I'm thinking of his name. He made a movie and a documentary on the way in which the current biodiversity pressure actually creates or drives new speciation, so new developments of species, because of the development of all those niche possibilities and niche possibilities as new ecosystem baselines. I think that we're going to see a new development of biodiversity, which might also lead to new charismatic species, but I don't know what they will look like yet.
Right.
Larger mammals, forget about it.
And the last one of the prompts, identity and culture.
Identity and culture. Ownership and taking responsibility, but in that responsibility not as a bad thing, as in blaming, but as in deriving who you are from nature and from your own being here, from caring. Yes, identity and culture are very important in this story. I think you know about the underwater deserts that we have created, so those are the places that I would go to in order to be exposed to the sad side of it.
Snorkeled by glass island recently.
Yeah.
It's very intense.
It's very intense. I saw the staghorn corals at Mangalhalto last week, and they're also dying now. Yeah, so it's all around us, these impacts. I always think that's one that we didn't touch upon, but Bubali Pond is the man-made sewage system of this island's hotel industry, and it's the largest avian bird biodiversity haven because all other water masses are lost for those birds. It's an interesting one.
That would be a good place to visit.
Yeah.
In the morning when the birds all wake up, it's really nice.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that in a while.
Well,
is there something you think we should do to strengthen our relationship with the ocean?
That's a bit of a difficult one for me. I myself, I put my head underwater a lot, and then I don't put sunscreen on, and I try to limit everything that I do and touch. But I do know that going into the water in itself is already a disruption, and having 120,000 people in the water all the time is not going to help our understanding. So I think what you're doing right now, having these conversations, is fundamental. Is that pretty good?
Yeah. No, we ask everyone, so we want to see like what everyone's perspective is.